Check.
The original Legend of Zelda game was released over 10 years before I was born, and in the 30 years since, it has remained a steady favorite of gamers throughout. And while some games are less universally loved, like Skyward Sword, a lot of these games have insanely high reputations, and it's maybe the only franchise, as much as I love Uncharted and as popular as GTA is, that can legitimately have two of its games in a serious discussion for the greatest of all time, those being 1998's Ocarina of Time and 2017's Breath of the Wild, and it is that modern game that we'll be talking about in today's episode. A quick overview to begin with. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was announced way back in 2013, but didn't see the light of day until 4 years later, and people, while impressed with early gameplay, were still a little bit skeptical that maybe the long development process meant bad news for the game. But not so. Breath of the Wild is currently sitting pretty at kinda 12th on Metacritic. But kinda 5th since it's rated a 97, so if you clump and don't differentiate between those 97s, then it's pretty much 5th. In terms of games that are actually above this one, we have its partner in crime Ocarina of Time, which sits at a 99, the highest rated game on the site, which is followed by three 98s in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, GTA 4, and Soul Calibur. GTA 4 is on there twice for God knows why, and while Metacritic isn't a make or break, and a lot of times it comes down to small changes in personal preference, especially once you cross that 90 rated threshold, it's very impressive for a modern game, since besides GTA 5, which, if you think about it, is still 4 years old, so even it's a little dated, you have to go back a significant few years to find games in that 95 and up range, so good on you, Zelda. This thing is basically selling Switches all by itself as well. The attachment rate between the two is crazy high. In fact, back in April, and maybe even still, there were actually more Zelda games being sold on the Switch than there were actual Switches being sold. People were buying the game before even buying the console. That's insane. It has a massive open world, bigger than Skyrim, and it fills it with both side quests and dungeons that are fun distractions and progressions. You can even make food by gathering materials from all around the world and use them to increase health. So can Link take a stab at our former competitors, or is it not all it's cracked up to be? Let's find out, starting first of all with story. The 30 years of Zelda have offered up a timeline that isn't exactly, well, it's pretty convoluted, and despite looking through tons of people explaining exactly how the timeline works, I'm still pretty damn confused, so let's try and go for the slightly simpler version of things. Pretty much our protagonist Link wakes up from 100 years of sleep, and when he starts exploring he stumbles across an old man, and after a while it's revealed that this is the spirit of the already dead King of Hyrule. The king tells Link, who is unable to access any of his memories, that 100 years ago an evil named Calamity Ganon started messing everything up in Hyrule. Then he tells you to go skedaddle on out of there and, I don't know, go check out some dungeons or something. As you progress in the game you start to be told about your past life and things start coming back. Essentially, when Ganon attacked 100 years ago, he nearly killed Link, who was saved and put to sleep by Princess Zelda. The four champions that were helping were corrupted by Ganon and became the divine beasts. The Guardians, which were these spider robot thingies crawling around everywhere, were turned evil, and Zelda herself used the last of her power to subdue Ganon and trap herself with him in Hyrule Castle. Now Ganon is getting stronger and ready to break free, so Link has to go over and save the entirety of Hyrule from that disaster by finding the divine beasts and freeing the champions inside, and ultimately has to take on Ganon himself. Zelda has been around for so long and it shows in the storytelling of this game. Not saying that it's bad, but it takes a very old-fashioned approach. There are sometimes encounters that are just subtitles and no actual voice acting, and while filled with lore, the story doesn't seem ever present in the game. It very much emphasizes gameplay over story, but the story isn't bad in any sense. It's just not essential to what makes this game great, and that's okay, not every game needs that. I do have to mention though that for the first time a Zelda game actually had some segments where it was voice acted, so that was pretty cool. And the voice acting was pretty alright, although nothing groundbreaking. Story might not be completely essential, but the characters are fun and wonky. It's a cartoon world, and while it may be very serious at times, maybe even tear-jerking, the characters feel pretty cartoony in their actions, and it's fun It's refreshing, it's goofy, all around they're pretty great. From the actual proper side characters like the King of Hyrule and Impa, to tiny reoccurring characters like the Koroks. Those things are pretty awesome and I like them. Also, interacting with a certain person and it being revealed that they're a super ninja assassin is pretty cool and can launch you into a battle at random times. Overall, the story is good at moving things along and is not bad by any means, but its style of presentation and lack of a whole ton of originality, it's really just get your memories back, fight the corrupted super dudes, and then fight an extremely large corrupted super dude, doesn't exactly put it on the same level as our last competitor, The Last of Us, in this particular category. Speaking of originality, let's talk a bit more about innovation. While being an open world game, it separates itself from most open world titles with its emphasis on puzzles, goal-oriented progress instead of simple sandbox nature, climbing, a heavy emphasis on nature with the ability to chop down trees, set grass on fire, cook things with supplies here and there, and be affected differently in different weather conditions. It's not completely revolutionary, but it adds a lot of unique and interesting new mechanics that give it a pretty unique feel instead of merging with other open world titles. Also, the cartoon world adds a different feel and look to the game that most other open world games don't have. In terms of innovation, it's no shadow of the Colossus, nor is it like its 20 years younger brother Ocarina of Time, but the sense of innovation leaves me with the same sentiment as what I had in the Last of Us episode. Not absolutely groundbreaking, but creating and perfecting where it needs to. Moving on to immersion, and while some Zelda fanatics get engrossed in every single detail, for someone who's on the younger side and wasn't allowed a console till the age of 13, meaning this is the first Zelda I've ever actually been able to get my hands on, they might get a different experience. Personally, I felt pretty invested in the world, and while I may not have had the same connection to the characters as older Zelda players, I still found them all to be fun and interesting. I read that the reason Link got his name was because he's supposed to link the player and the game. Pretty much you're supposed to impose yourself on this character and feel like he is you. While this game doesn't actually give you the option to name your character, which each of the previous Zeldas allowed you to do, and this was done to make voice acting way easier, that idea still stands here. I felt like the actions in the game were my actions, and while that may be a duh moment since this is a video game, this game did it more so than a lot of others, especially the other two that I've talked about in this series. A big factor in that is the fact that this is a non-linear game. Wander has to kill the Colossi to progress, no matter how bad you feel for them. Every shot you take as Joel feels like Joel is shooting that person, not you, because Joel is a heavily established character. But the more free attitude of this game makes it feel like you are the hero of Hyrule, and that, while being a different type of immersion than our previous two contenders, is still very immersive nonetheless. Oh, and being able to capture and name your horse was amazing. I got so attached to each and every one that I managed to catch. That was maybe even my favorite part of the entire game. Gameplay here was drastically different than most games I've played in the past, with the only sword-based game I can name off the top of my head being Shadow of Mordor, and the only one with the prevalent use of a bow and arrow being Crisis, and that's much more future-based. And I guess The Last of Us also to some degree. But I still thoroughly enjoyed the combat and other elements of the gameplay. While the stamina bar is a little too harsh in the beginning for my liking, and the weapons break all the time, even the Master Sword, aside from those minor annoyances, everything is really tight in this gameplay experience. The bow and arrow feel great, and even in the motion sensor mode they can be pretty fun, and the various attacks and dodges are a nice dance that adds a small flair of strategy into the mix. Conserving really good weapons for major battles because of the breakable nature of items also adds some challenge. And besides combat, movement is also pretty fun. Climbing, especially early on, gives a huge feeling of, can I make it? Can I make it? Yes, I made it! And the horses are fun to use, plus the glider is really entertaining and useful as well. Also, the ability to mix certain foods together to give health boosts plus a couple of other perks is really cool and calls for experimentation. Although I do wish there were a few more unique mixtures. Dungeons are amazing and require real thought sometimes, and the powers you have really come into play, and it's always a blast and a feeling of accomplishment when you complete one. Even tiny things like cutting down a tree so you can light the wood on fire and not take damage in cold areas adds a small sense of detail, survival, and adds to the feeling that yes, this is you playing the game rather than you playing as a character that is in the game. Music is a mixed bag. While some themes in certain areas can be pretty good, they're not as good as some of the ones I've looked up from previous games, and the non-specific music, the stuff that plays when you're just roaming around on an adventure, is kinda, well, boring. It's not adventure-y, it's barely even there, it feels like. It's extremely minimalistic. Music is not really that big of a deal to me, and I can entirely overlook it, but it is important to some people, and if you are looking for a memorable soundtrack, you probably won't find it here. Finally, art design is amazing. I love the Neanderthal-like enemies, the lizard dudes, the larger, graceful yet terrifying boss types, the giants, the skeletons, the ever-present guardians, the massive Shadow of the Colossus deja vu-inducing divine beasts, and of course, Calamity Ganon. Besides the enemies though, this is just a beautiful world, and on countless occasions I stop to take screenshots because honestly, sometimes this game just looks like a beautiful painting, and I did this more so than I've done with any other game before. I love everything about how this game looks. And now decision time. While I try to be as objective as possible, obviously some personal preference is going to bleed in. I think Link has fought his way past Wander and Aggro and dropped Shadow of the Colossus down a peg to third place, and as for The Last of Us, well, this is a tough call for me. All three games are vastly different and that makes this decision all the more difficult. Zelda also hasn't sat with me for as long, only releasing a few months ago, while The Last of Us I played a crazy amount of times in the past 2 years. Right now I can't make a definitive decision, it's really in a deadlock position for me. For the time being I'll place it at number 2 because personally that's probably where I would rank these, and tag it with an up for reconsideration. I'll revisit this game at the end of a later episode and try to decide once and for all whether it will topple the current king or fall just short in the end. That said, if you guys want to give your thoughts on the matter, go ahead and comment below. Also, let me know what you guys want as your next competitor, and if you want to see the series branch off a little to some other topics, like best developer, best franchise, best character, etc. Oh, and be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming Mario song parody, as well as my first installment of a new series called Under the Influence. Episode 1 will cover how Arkham games helped shape Insomniac's upcoming PS4 exclusive Spider-Man game. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys all in the next video.